Let's be clear, there are no winners here. The words of President Barack Obama as he chastised Congress over the damage done to America's economy by the government shutdown. That shutdown and the debt ceiling standoff that led to it are the subjects of today's debate here on The Voice of Russia. I'm the host, Hywel Davies. It's not been an edifying spectacle. For 16 days, large sections of the American federal government closed as Republicans and Democrats wrangled over draft budgets. More than 700,000 government employees were affected, and initially at least, national parks and museums closed, pension and veterans benefit checks were delayed, and visa and passport applications went unprocessed. Just a day before the US government would have defaulted on its debt, with potentially disastrous consequences for the world economy, a deal was reached. That allows the government to borrow to cover its $17 trillion debt. But the agreement only provides money for the budget until mid-January. And with the ideological differences between the two sides over taxes, healthcare and spending levels seemingly unresolved, do we face the prospect of a similar crisis in just 3 months' time? Here to discuss the many issues around this huge subject are Jan Helper-Hayes, who's on the Executive Committee for Republicans Abroad UK, Peter Oppenheimer, an economist at Christ Church College, Oxford, Keith Boyfield, Research Fellow at the Centre for Policy Studies, and John Owens, Professor of US Government and Politics at the University of Westminster. If I might start with you, Peter, how much has this hurt the American economy?
Well, logically, not very much. Look, it caused momentary discomfort. There ought, in all logic, to be a spike upwards to recover the discomfort that various sections of the population have experienced. Having said that, look, people who are not well off, who are on low incomes, who live from hand to mouth, will have had real suffering of some kind through lack of cash. And it's scandalous that irresponsible politicking should have brought this result. But in the broad scheme of things, the damage to the US economy is short-term and fleeting. And the question is to stop repeated bouts of this in future.
But isn't that what the real damage is? Because it's repeated uncertainty. We've still got more uncertainty going forward.
Well, we have. And one hopes that the various factions in Capitol Hill, as it were, will be able to do something to stop this. There would have to be a great deal of repetition for there to be significant damage, I have to say, to the status of the dollar.
I think this latest episode has been a wake-up call, particularly to the Chinese, who hold $1.3 trillion worth of US Treasury bills. The whole point about US Treasury bills is it acts as the benchmark for risk-free investment, with the prospect of not actually having those US Treasury bills paid for. They're no longer risk-free investments. And I think that increasingly investors, banks and so on around the world, sovereign wealth funds, are going to be looking to invest there in other assets that are not denominated in dollars.
There's a quote here from the official Xinhua news agency, the Chinese news agency. Politicians in Washington have done nothing substantial but postponing once again the final bankruptcy of global confidence in the US financial system.
Well,
and the Republicans are taking a lot of the heat for this, aren't they?
They are, and rightly so, actually. But at the same time, the Senate, with Harry Reid, has not been willing to produce a budget. If the Senate would produce a budget, or at least work with the House that has produced a budget numerous times, then these games would stop.
In a way, the fundamental issue is how the hell did the United States, that great country, end up, or rather start, with a constitution that puts the control of the budget in the hands of the legislature, not the executive? That's really getting down to fundamentals, and that's the root of the problem.
John Owens, our professor here.
Well, you took the words out of my mouth, of course. You have a feudal constitution. Which other country in the world allows the legislature to decide what the debt limit is? You have an inefficient governmental system designed for inefficiency. Remember what Thomas Jefferson said, the government least is the best kind of government. And this crisis, of course, just demonstrates, I think, the inadequacies of the American system. But it's also compounded. I mean, one could have made this criticism over the last 200 or so years, but of course this is compounded now by the polarization between the parties, and also the sharp divisions within the Republican Party. You have a faction within the Republican Party that's going to oppose the Democrats and the Democratic president by all means necessary.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia, and today we're discussing the ongoing political crisis in the United States over the debt ceiling. I'm joined by Jan Halper-Hayes, who's on the Executive Committee of Republicans Abroad UK, Peter Oppenheimer, an economist at Christ Church College, Oxford, Keith Boyfield, Research Fellow at the Centre for Policy Studies, and by John Owens, Professor of US Government and Politics at the University of Westminster. Jan.
I don't exactly see it that way because I don't see the Democrats compromising either. Even though on one hand Obama was right to say I will not negotiate with you, at the same time the fact that it carried on for so long with no one negotiating does not set a good example for anyone, for our children, and for our reputation abroad. But I do think that if the Senate produced a budget, and they work, because that's the way our Constitution is, the House decides if you can spend it, but they have to come together and make some kind of agreement.
That's one way of putting it. There's a wonderful quote from Paul Krugman. So you have this neighbor who has been making your life hell. First, he files a spurious lawsuit. You're both suffering from huge legal bills. Then he threatened bodily harm to your family. Now, however, he says he's willing to compromise. He'll call off the lawsuit, which is to his advantage as well as yours. But in return, you must give him your car. And he'll stop threatening your family, but only for a week, after which the threats will continue. Not much of an offer, is it?
Paul Krugman is a believer in big government and is probably one of the most preeminent Keynesian economists in the United States. What we're looking at here are a number of people within the Republican Party who believe that we should have limited government.
Or no government. And
the key phrase that I notice is that they don't want to have business as usual. No. So you're correct in arguing that they're being very, very militant in their posture.
Although they're being militant in their posture, I think there's a problem with the infighting that's going on. And I think that they are holding on to a lifeline because it has been a party of gray-haired white men. And they are having a hard time accepting that there are several other ways of doing things. And all of you could probably tell me at what point the Christian Coalition took control of the Republican Party, but we used to be a moderate party. It used to be the party of the unions, of the Afro-Americans. And I can tell you that the majority of people who I know and who are definitely expats that care about our country and our Republicans are very much centrist.
And what happened was, of course, the Civil Rights Act in 1960. That explains this, because the Southerners used to vote solid Democrat. Now they vote solid Republican. They're just as conservative as they were. So what we have seen is what I call an ideologization of the party system. So the conservatives are Republican and the Democrats are liberal.
It can't be only that. Can I just make a point? We've all said, here's this 18th century constitution. Yes, it is. But it's only...
worked.
A, it's worked, but B, more important, this particular kind of scaremongering episode, if I may call it that, has only happened a couple of times in America's history in the 20th century, and not even in the sort of entire post-Keynesian period. When I knew we were going to have this broadcast, I went and looked up a couple of books by Herb Stein, who was a distinguished economist, Chicago, by
Chairman
the
of
way.
the Economic Advisors on the Nixon.
And he wrote about the Kennedy tax cut, and he wrote about fiscal policy in the 60s and 70s, and into the 80s, fat books. Now, this problem of limit on debt and paralysis of the US government through legislative abuse of their doesn't even appear in the index to that book. So remote was it from concerns. But the Constitution hasn't been changed.
I think I'm right in saying that this debt limitation was actually only introduced in the First World War. It was not something that went back to the Founding Fathers, although presumably the American Constitution allows Congress to set this debt.
But it's still been able to run for decades without anybody worrying about it too much until,
in the last couple
86?
of years, we've noticed increasing preponderance amongst certain elements in the Republican Party to say we're simply not going to approve the US government's ability to borrow. And as far as I can see, what the last couple of weeks have produced is negative watch from Fitch, one of the credit rating agencies. And I think that this is where the Americans are going to realize that this type of behavior is simply going to have huge implications for the strength of the dollar, and also for their ability to borrow. It's going to be more expensive for the US government to borrow, isn't it?
Well, but I want to go back to something Professor Owen said, because I think the crux of it is the ideology. And what you have when someone has an ideology, my real life job is as a corporate psychologist, is that it holds on to their values. And it's not holding on to a way of doing something, it's a way of being. And so people then feel you're criticizing my way of being, or I know how to be better than other people. And as long as we have politics on both sides that is fighting for ideology as opposed to how do you run a country, then I don't see these problems ending.
What we've seen over the last few years is a kind of procedural arms race. We know over the last few weeks that there has probably been a majority within the House of Representatives in favour of opening up the government. And yet, because of the so-called Hastert rule, the Republican leadership is not allowed to bring a bill to the floor of the House of Representatives unless a majority of the Republicans supports that. Now, what we have at the moment is about 20 or 30 Republicans. Add them to the Democrats, and you have a majority for opening the government. But it's been prevented by this procedural rule, which may have no status at all, but it's accepted. And of course, the ultra-conservatives love it because it means they can exercise a veto.
Peter?
Can I say something about the ultra-conservatives? Somebody said that this is going to have drastic effects on the strength of the dollar in the long run. Several of you. Keith said that. Now, can I just point out that, oversimplifying slightly, most of the extreme Republicans who are responsible for this don't know what is meant by the strength of the dollar because they don't go abroad and they don't think of the dollar in relation to other countries. The dollar internally will be perfectly strong. You can use it to buy what you want. So what all is this nonsense concept?
Of Harold Wilson.
It's partly a joke.
Pocket,
yes, it's partly a joke, but not entirely.
Well, and you're so right, because I couldn't vote for Bush because I thought, how could I vote for someone who's been out of the country 3 times, probably all 3 times to Mexico, when you have a father of the stature that your father is, where you could have had contacts and understood the global view, and instead you have this very myopic view.
You're doing a very bad job of standing up for Republicans abroad.
You know what? No, I don't think I am, because I think I really speak of the moderate voice, and that a lot of us feel that way.
Do you feel that there is increasingly the Tea Party element taking over the party that you joined and are enthusiastic about?
No, I don't think that they're taking over, but the thing is that we used to have activists. They weren't elected people. And what has happened is we now have elected activists who are there that can control things.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia, and today we're discussing the ongoing political crisis in the United States over the debt ceiling. I'm joined by Jan Halper-Hayes, who's on the Executive Committee of Republicans Abroad UK, Peter Oppenheimer, an economist at Christ Church College, Oxford, Keith Boyfield, Research Fellow at the Centre for Policy Studies, and by John Owens, Professor of US Government and Politics at the University of Westminster. Sorry, Keith, go.
To make the observation that the elective activists in the Republican Party are having the effect of losing the Republicans any attraction whatsoever with the sort of ethnic vote, I suppose you could describe it in America, or new immigrants.
That's right.
And it's very interesting. I was at an event at the London School of Economics not so long ago, where the point was being made that a lot of middle-class Chinese Americans who've been in the country for maybe only 30, 40 years rather like government expenditure programs and federal government expenditure programs, and they're the people who've been sending their kids to college, which has been partly funded by federal government. So on the whole, a lot of these immigrant groups are in favour of public expenditure, whereas I think when you look at the election result last time round, the Republicans won, am I not right in saying, a majority amongst traditional white American voters.
Well, this is the O'Leary comment. After the 2012 election, this is the end of white America, and Republicans really haven't got that leverage in the electorate that they used to have. And just looking at an NBC Wall Street Journal poll a couple of weeks ago, I think maybe last week, 70% of respondents thought Republicans were putting their own agenda ahead of what's good for the country. 47% have negative feelings towards the Tea Party.
But didn't that same poll say that there was an element of a plague on both the houses, in that Democrats were also getting some blame from many voters too?
Yes, Obama's rating isn't that great.
60%.
Well, Obama's 47% positive against 41% negative, which is about par for most post-war presidents. There are exceptions.
Okay.
It's not an exception. But since we're talking about polls now, I mean, what are the ramifications now for the 2014 midterm elections? It was assumed that the Republicans would be pretty safe in the House, and may actually take control of the Senate. Now it could be the House is in play. I mean, a lot could be happening. It's too early on, but crucially, at this time, candidates are being recruited for the party, and if you're a Republican, you probably not want to be that keen on being recruited, whereas the Democrats will be up. So this could have the effect of producing a whole lot of good Democratic candidates, which will make various seats competitive in the 2014 election. It is true, it's very early at the moment. The generic poll shows that the Democrats are slightly up, but on the basis, if you go back to the shutdown of 95-96, Democrats only gained 9 seats. They need 17. And I think that's the most likely results. Democrats are likely to become a little short.
Jan, the Republicans have shot themselves in the foot.
I think that, yes, is the short answer. And the longer answer is that the moderate Republicans caved in to this faction, because not only are they activists in Washington, D.C., but then they become activists against the moderate Republicans. And you had said to me before, I'm not doing a very good job for Republicans abroad, but actually I'm trying to show that there is a voice of reason. And just as much as there have become these factions in politics, our media is just full of factions, and they have made the Republicans sound like they're these unreasonable, extreme people. And the thing is that what happened to being a liberal Republican? What happened to the fact that we do care?
Sorry, Keith, you were trying to come in and make the point about that these Republicans aren't going to appeal at the next election to any of the minority votes.
And I was wondering how many Hispanic and Black American candidates will be representing the Republicans. On this point about the media, I suppose you could argue that Fox News has acted as a catalyst to polarize the debate. And those people who are not too keen on Rupert Murdoch will blame him, I suspect, for part of this.
This is the Voice of Russia, broadcasting from the heart of London. From Monday to Friday, we're live here on digital from 4 p.m. until 8. We're also online at ruvr.co.uk. Tune in for current affairs, news, arts and debate.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia, and today we're discussing the ongoing political crisis in the United States over the debt ceiling. I'm joined by Jan Halper-Hayes, who's on the Executive Committee of Republicans Abroad UK, Peter Oppenheimer, an economist at Christ Church College, Oxford, Keith Boyfield, Research Fellow at the Centre for Policy Studies, and by John Owens, Professor of US Government and Politics at the University of Westminster. Peter?
Important point when you said that it's the war within the Republicans, because most people, I think, looking from abroad would say, right, if the legislature controls the budget, then the danger is the usual kind of split tickets, as we say, if you have a president from one party.
Divided government.
Divided government, and legislature from the other. But you're saying, actually, it isn't so, because there are plenty of examples, are there? I asked the question, with divided government, ticket splitting, a Democratic president, Republican control of most of Congress, which has worked perfectly reasonably. And the real problem now is the internal war in the Republicans.
Past performance is not a guidance to future performance.
The other thing
If
is
things
that
have got
people
worse
used to
last-
come to Washington, D.C. to be a public servant and go back and do their other job. But what has happened is we have career politicians. And these more senior career politicians on both sides are afraid of losing their job. And that is where they're putting their own interests above the common good and being a public
You
servant.
also saw President Obama reinstate the Republican Secretary of State for Defense. And I remember, I think it was Nixon who employed Senator Moynihan as the US ambassador at the UN.
Well, the
so
current
there's a
defense secretary is a
tradition of
Republican, a former senator. Chuck Hagel is a former senator. So that's there you have examples of Obama trying to be bipartisan. Yes. Only it hasn't worked. It doesn't work. You've got a polarized system. You just get damaged when you try to be bipartisan.
But he's not trying to be bipartisan. He's giving tokens of being bipartisan, but he is so wedded to his ideology and not willing to bend at all. And Reagan said, I'd rather have half a loaf than the whole loaf. And, we need both sides compromising a bit more.
But hang on. I mean, the key legislation of Obamacare, he has watered it down, has he? So you can't say he hasn't.
But here's something else about Obama is he hasn't made friends on the Hill with either the Democrats or the Republicans. When he wanted to go to Syria and suddenly he realized there was going to be some opposition, he had held himself above everyone else, whether it was his Democratic colleagues.
That's not the point, is it? He did water down from the initial proposals for Obamacare, and it bent over backwards to try and get support from the Republicans, and they're still vehemently
He has not watered down on Obamacare.
Well,
and the Republicans, frankly,
like
were
very health service, for example.
No, but that's what people say to me. But people don't understand. It was never going to be the National Health Service. It was going to be affordable insurance.
Right.
And that is where the big problem was, because what they should have done is come over to the UK and understand what a National Health Service is all about. But we have all the lobbying bodies as well that get into play for the businesses and everything else. And so then they're trying to keep everyone happy. And what it has become is it is only insurance. It is not. It is still our same HMOs and everything else. But now 26-year-olds are still insured. And if you have something, a pre-existing condition, I think those are fine. But why didn't he just create insurance for the people who didn't have insurance?
Well, we can go and revisit the Affordable Care Act, but I think we're talking about the fiscal crisis here. The point that I would make is, if it wasn't the Affordable Health Care Act, it'd be something else. They'd find something else to object to denying an increase in the debt limit or a clean continuing resolution.
Okay, so if we do have this rump that will not be budged, then are we going to have exactly the same problem in 3 months' time?
Yes, because what we're currently discussing is the idea of sequestration, which is this idea of salami slicing, where you might cut, say, 10% off the budget across the board. I think what the Senate and the House of Representatives are trying to do is prioritise programmes for cuts. I actually can't see that happening in the course of the next 3 months. I think we're going to continue seeing salami slicing. And I've read that there's going to be quite significant cuts in the US defence budget, just at the time when they really are wanting to go the other way.
We've sort of assumed that basically America faces no economic problems. Now, you can make that case, but do we actually believe that? Say all these problems, so-called problems, are just manufactured. Now, it is the case that, for example, the US public debt as a percentage of the gross domestic product is over 100%, which is 3 times what it was 50 years ago. It is true that America has, for example, it's got fracking and marvellous natural gas fuel supplies, high tech, it doesn't have to be talked about. But at the same time, their trade balance is bad. They are running a chronic deficit and accumulating a lot of debt, which a lot of us think is actually in itself a bad thing, just as the Chinese surpluses piling up dollar holdings are a bad thing. Don't we think there are some problems which ought to be addressed?
And Peter, they've also got to look at their sort of cost of factors of production. It's no longer the low-cost manufacturing jobs that are going to China. Increasingly, you're seeing people in China, Malaysia and so on doing those jobs that have traditionally been done by college graduates in the United States.
Okay.
They're hemorrhaging those jobs.
Well, even more strongly then, don't we think there are problems? And has this battle anything at all to do with a constructive approach to solving those problems? Or is it completely
I was going
irrelevant?
to say, can we make the direct connection between perhaps a mismanaged government and economics here? Is it directly connected in your view?
Well, in my view, both in Europe and America, the one thing that distinguishes politicians and political leaders is they have had no experience of actually running anything. And the only thing that they have in common with one another is that they've been sort of in the political game. And I think that's becoming increasingly a problem. We no longer have industrialists, bankers and so on with experience of the real world. And they've gone into politics straight from college, university, and they've been inside the Beltway in Washington for 15 years before they get elected into office.
And what's worse is the majority of them are lawyers.
Yeah.
And and so we have no one that has any practical experience in the real world. They're in their heads all the time and develop their side of the argument, but don't take the other side of the argument.
No longer do we have a President Hoover who invented rather a useful thing around the house.
But we come back to the American political system, which is deliberately designed to be highly porous. The emphasis was not on efficient government, the emphasis was on representative government. So whenever a bill comes up, you get the lobbyists, you get the members of Congress listening to the folks back home. That's how they get re-elected. And usually the solution is more spending. The classic example is, of course, what has done this deal? Why has Mitch McConnell come on with the, $6 billion canal?
The $3 billion
$3 billion
for
canal.
Kentucky that
Illinois,
was snuck in. That was snuck in, and actually, it was Dianne Feinstein and Lamar Alexander, both Democrats, that suggested it go into the bill. But I'm sure in the back room it was because McConnell is being threatened by the Tea Party right now, and he had to bring something home if he was going to compromise with Harry Reid.
But the point I would make, that is classic American politics. That is classic give and take between the different institutions. You know, that's how it worked. That's how they finally got a solution.
Exactly.
Okay, we're running out of time here. Can I just have one final question to all of you? I'd ask you to answer quite briefly. Do you think in 3 months' time we will be stuck where we are now, or stuck where we are last week, or some solution will be reached? John?
Absolutely. It'll be redux in either January or February. We're going to see exactly the same thing. Nothing will change.
Peter?
Let me put the opposite view. History repeats itself, every half century, every century. Over 3 months, that's a bit too short. I think they'll find a way out and have a longer postponement next time.
Jan?
If the continual infighting in the Republican Party is not resolved, then I think that you're going to see the same thing again with other issues come about. If they do resolve it, then I think that they might have been watching the polls and will change their behavior because we're now in 2014 and they'll start campaigning.
Keith?
60% of the world's foreign currency reserves are currently held in US dollars. I think increasingly you'll find the holders of those dollars looking to exchange them for another currency or even gold.
And will that make a difference to the extreme Republicans? No.
Thank you all very much. I just say thank you to my guests, Jan Helper-Hayes on the Executive Committee of Republicans Abroad, Peter Oppenheimer of Oxford University, Keith Boyfield, Research Fellow at the Centre for Policy Studies, and John Owens, Professor of US Government at the University of Westminster. Thank you all very much indeed.